The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Now, if we have done our jobs correctly, you have not heard any break in our coverage. However, we've been away from this book, and I can tell you that I have never been so anxious to get back and just finish the dang book, because we are in a very exciting portion of The Great Hunt. This episode, just for your tracking, is covering Chapter 42, Falme, and Chapter 43, A Plan. I, of course, the guy excited to keep reading because I don't know what happens. I'm Greg. And joining me is Tylor, a guy who knows what's happening, but I think is going to be still very excited to continue. Tylor, how are you?
I am doing very well. I will say, I think you've mentioned this kind of concept earlier. We are 100% in my I would read this in one night range, right? Like you end a plan and you need to see how the plan goes. And we don't get to for another week. And that is my one hiccup with this podcast is every time I finish an episode, I want to read again. And then I realize that will mean I have to wait 7 days until I can read again. How have you been managing as a first-time reader? I feel like this is a tough section of the book to say, let's take 3 weeks off. How are you feeling with the development and then slowdown?
Well, I will say, there is a school of thought that defines adultery as just impure thoughts, no action, but impure thoughts. And so if that is our relationship, I had some impure thoughts. I definitely was like, I could read the rest of this and just not tell Tylor and take good enough notes to know what to bring up and what to not. But I will say that I stayed faithful over our 2-week break. I think somewhere in the middle of it, we texted each other being like, dang, I really want to read. So it was a very tricky moment, just the way our personal life, we don't have to be mysterious. We both took a vacation that was pre-planned. And so it was like, oh, we can't record that week. So we banked ahead and then are ready. So I did wait, though, because I didn't want to come in having read this after we recorded 2 weeks ago. And so I just read fresh yesterday and was like, oh, right, I was really anxious. And now I'm really anxious again. I was at Disney World. And so I saw a million children on leashes. And every time I was shaking my fist at them. So
I will say, in order to stave off my Wheel of Time boredom for having 2.5 weeks without reading, I discovered a classic of Reddit, which was someone who made a meme about every chapter of the Wheel of Time. And I felt a little bad when I kept memeing past this chapter, but not as bad as I would have if I had kept reading. So kudos on both of us and on any of you at home who managed to not read ahead. I am impressed because we have an incentive to do this. You just do it to listen to our voices, and that's rad. I think we spent enough time talking about how much self-control and willpower we have. I suggest we dive into chapter 42, Falme, which begins with Nynaeve and Elaine hiding in an alley to avoid being noticed by Damane. We find that these two characters have been in the city of Falme for presumably a week or several weeks, and they've had some adventures. It seems like both of them are avoiding channeling. We learn about one time in the past when Nynaeve channeled in order to try to detach a Suldam from her necklace. We learn, one, that this seemed to work, but two, the characters were absolutely shocked that it was actually the Damane who called the alarm and made sure that someone put her back in a leash. And then finally, we learned after that there was a large period of time, I believe they say several days, when the Damane were scouring the city, trying to find whoever channeled in the city. this is why Nynaeve is so upset when she learns that Elaine has channeled to try to steal some apples because she is worried that they are going to get caught. The girls end up spending a decent amount of time arguing about which one of them is more careful before eventually they decide to eat the stolen apples and watch the building where it seems all of the Damane are constantly coming in and out of. This is where we then join Egwene from her POV. Egwene is looking out the window. She sees that Rena, the woman who is in charge of her training, is in view, and so she knows that she's not going to be surprised. Initially, she tries to do a small bit of channeling to see if she can break out of her necklace, but she is not able to do so. And it is at this point that Min arrives. Min apparently is giving weekly visits, and we learn a lot of details about how Egwene is being trained, and it is not good. We learn a lot about changing of names and punishments and things that make you feel sick and what you can and cannot do while you are wearing the Adam. And it's bad news bears. I'm not going to get into all of it because I'm sure we will discuss it in a lot more detail. But eventually Rena returns. She realizes that Egwene has been channeling, and she changes Egwene's name to Tuli and starts punishing her an enormous amount. We also learn that Egwene is very soon going to be brought to Seanchan because she has the power to be able to detect metals, and this, it seems, is a very rare power among Damane. So all of this combines to basically add to what you were describing before. I am really anxious for what happens to Egwene at the end of this book. How did you sit with this chapter, Falme, which I honestly found to be one of the densest chapters we've had so far? There is just an enormous amount of world building packed into these 11 pages. What was your take on the chapter overall?
Yeah, I think I was feeling the weight of that, and just coupled with surprise that this was happening so late in the book. I mean, we've talked a lot about, headed into this home stretch. It feels like, most fantasy books of this length, we would actually be in the final big
Yeah.
conflict or whatever was going to happen at the end of this book. So I think I was surprised that this was not that, but yet at the same time, I think I spent the majority of my time trying to play, okay, how long has it been? And that
Yeah.
calls back to our last episode where we talked about, okay, Rand and his crew skipped this big gap of time. We then saw what happened to Egwene and the capture, and realizing, that she was probably going to be there if we were jumping back. Now, as my first question was, when is this? I think you gave that in your summary. You're saying this is seemingly a couple weeks into the couple months that we think has to pass before Rand shows
Yeah,
up.
I think we had said it was between like a month and a half to 2 months from when Egwene was captured to when Rand arrived on Falme. My guess is we've probably covered most, but not all of that time, right? We hear details from Egwene and Nynaeve that seem to sum up at least probably a couple weeks. We can't get too much more descriptive than that. But given that we're just coming out of a chapter from Rand's POV, I think maybe like 6 of the 8 weeks seems like a pretty good guess.
Well, and I think keeping it vague is the smart way to play such things, right? When you lock it in too specifically. I also just want to go back to, I will admit, if I was not reading this with you, I'm not sure I would have picked up on the kind of differences there.
Yeah.
So that makes me think they can't be that important. It's something that the readers have figured out, but you just need to know they came apart and they're coming back together, I think is my suspicion.
Absolutely. And I think that this kind of plays into what I think of as the reason for the interesting dynamic that you're describing, right? We spend just an enormous amount of time with Rand in this book. And then we get about 5 chapters to grapple with everything from the girls arrived at the White Tower to captured and being broken as a slave. And I think that that imbalance has always struck me as odd and is maybe one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of this book. I'd be much more interested in the Egwene, Nynaeve, Elaine chapters than I am a lot of the Rand ones. But I think to some degree, all of this comes down to Robert Jordan's philosophy about how he wants to portray darkness in this series. And I would contrast this against George R.R. Martin, right? I think if George R.R. Martin had had Egwene get captured, we would have had 12 Egwene chapters about the horrible things that were done to her while she was captured. And Robert Jordan wants just as dark of things to happen to his characters, and he wants to do the like PG-13 turn to the candle thing, where he doesn't actually show any of the R-rated stuff, even though it exists in his world. And personally, as a reader, I prefer that. And so I find
Mm,
myself in this chapter kind of torn between I wish I was getting more from these characters who I think are both more interesting as characters and have the more interesting plot in this book. But I'm also kind of like, thank you, Robert Jordan. I didn't need 10 chapters of Breaking the Slave. I'm good with a couple of memories, and then we get to something after, or at least a different stage of the process. What are your thoughts on that kind of choice of Robert Jordan's? Because I think you're saying this chapter feels a little odd as a result of it, and I'm saying I think this is a deliberate choice that has kind of shaped the entire book up to this point.
yeah, I would say it is not expected. And I do agree that I like it. The other thing I would like in this too is actually my son. We got through the pre-show on the Haunted Mansion, and he wanted to bail. He's like, "We need to go. Like, we cannot possibly go into this cart that's going to take us into the Haunted Mansion." I was like, "You're good, buddy." And then he was not scared once, but
Yep.
in his mind, it was going to be this horrific, hellish journey. I'm like,
Yeah.
"No, this is Disney World." Uh, so I liken that to, so I think what you said is right, but it actually often becomes scarier because
Right.
you get to fill in those details and you get to think about what that would actually be like. And, some of those details, as you said, are horrific. I thought a lot about how she just had the passing thought to hit
Yeah.
Rena with the jug and then felt physical pain and couldn't touch the jug for weeks until she
Yep.
trained herself. And so, again, I think you're right. George R. R. Martin or a lot of other people would like, let's revel in that. Let's describe every instant of that experience. But this just lets me picture that and kind of choose your own horror level, I guess.
Yeah, I think the version of this that actually this reminded me of as you were describing it is one of your favorite shows, Andor. The way that they describe the Imperial torture technique of it being like the screaming of an unseen race that we never hear anything else about scarred me in a way that could
Yeah.
not have happened if they had given any more details about that process. And I think you're right. This is actually kind of knowing when to show it and when to leave it unsaid, I think is a really delicate and difficult problem. And I'll give Robert Jordan a lot of credit for it, even though I think it kind of skews the first half of this book in terms of what we're focusing on. Egwene's story should take place over 4 chapters. It's just weird that they take place right before the conclusion because of the timeline issues that Robert Jordan is
Mm.
working through. That
Well,
being,
I think that's the unintended consequence, and it's really
yeah,
unfortunate, right? Because it does make Rand feel like the main character, where it's a little more balanced. And now I assume we are far beyond where the television show currently is, but it'll be
yep,
really interesting to see because I think my understanding of the business is Amazon said HBO is making a ton of money with dragons. Let's make some things like that and see if
yep,
we can make a ton of money. And so, are they going to try to dial up the kind of torture and sex and all those things to try to really be their own version of Game of Thrones, or are they going to stick to it? But I will say, I think if you just in editing, I imagine they would put those plot lines together, and stretching it out is going to make it a lot more horrific, even if they
yeah.
still kind of refrain from showing those things that are most terrifying. So curious to see. I mean, I'm curious to see all of it, and we'll get more into our plans for some of that later. But I think it's really interesting how tastes have changed, I guess is why I would use a marker of that.
Yeah.
That this feels like the world where PG-13 is new, and
Uh-huh.
now we're pushing on and on into everything should be R-rated. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think overall, I think this is exactly where I am at with this section of the book. It is really effectively done, but it's effectively done in a way that's very different from what I'm used to seeing in other fantasy series. And I'm not sure whether to applaud that or point it out as an oddity, but I'm okay with either or both of those reactions. All of this obviously has to do with the second half of the chapter. The
Mm,
first half is to introduce us to the dilemma that Nynaeve and Elaine find themselves in. And this, I think, is a really interesting chapter for me because it is all world building from where I'm sitting. It is 2
yeah.
characters where we know their situation in a place we know nothing about, just watching for 11 pages. Or, well, I guess only 5 or 6 of those pages are this section of the chapter. What jumped out to you here about life in Falme? Because this is our kind of first slice of life in this city when we've had a lot of hints about what is going on here.
Yeah, it was almost like we saw the opening capture of this city in some ways, and now it's
Mhm.
like here's how things have progressed and where
Yeah.
things are standing. So in terms of details that came out, I was first most interested in Nynaeve, and the fact that they have managed to stay hidden was impressive, right? But
Mhm.
kind of expected in that if we're jumping forward in time again, it's like, well, we would have seen the good bits. But the fact that, they're not like thriving, they're
No.
barely hanging on. They are seemingly on the edge of starvation. Nynaeve has been giving up her rations to make sure Elaine gets enough. I think all of those details, the character details, were probably what was most
Yeah.
compelling to me. The nice bit of play where we hear in this chapter that she's wearing Lan's ring, and then
Yeah.
we see it in the next chapter, kind of a reminder of the romance and what's going on. That was a nice bit, and I was like, yes, I caught a romance detail. Yes, I'm
Nice.
not a cold, unfeeling guy. And then over to the world building. I kind of made notes on two things, and I'm sure you have much more than that. First is it sounds really interesting that essentially the Seanchan just took over a block and are like, this is where we're
Yeah.
keeping the women. And it made it sound, like eminent domain, and then they just need to keep them all controlled. And more on that in a minute. And then the other part was the long description of the beasts, which I'm
Yeah.
like, I had trouble picturing. I wrote in my notes simply sounds weird, like
Yeah.
sounds like a weird looking beast. So those were the two world building details that stood out to me.
Yeah, I think the beasts were really interesting to me as much for the description, which I'm with you. I can never picture anything in my head, so I'm maybe not the best for this, but I have a really hard time distinguishing like the Gralm from the Sreddit from the
Right.
whatever other things are wandering around among the Seanchan. But I think the reaction of the people around them to those beasts is really interesting. I think a lot of the description is focused on like crowds backing up and when do they bow and when do they acknowledge certain people. And I think thinking about what does it mean to be under the yoke of the Seanchan is really interesting, especially as Egwene and Nynaeve are having this debate about whether or not the people in Falme should be rebelling or pushing back. And it seems that Nynaeve's position is like, how could you ever do that with monsters roaming the streets? And then the
Mm.
other thing that I found interesting in what you said is you said, look, it looks like they kind of just took over a block. They took it and it's theirs now. That immediately reminded me of the way that they handled Bail Domon in the chapter we had of his when he arrived,
Mm.
where it seemed as if it wasn't even Turok taking the seal from him. They interpreted it as like a soldier legally took it from him and gave it to her commander, who could give it to Turok as her gift to him. And that
Mm.
way of thinking of kind of everything as being theirs, I think we're seeing a really interesting kind of example of that in the sense of like, oh, yeah, we just want this entire city block of buildings for our Damane. You're going to give those to us, right? And it seems like that kind of is how it happened. And so, if nothing else, this is a chapter to me that gives me the impression of just like a city under siege. The people here seem pretty broken in all of the details we give of them. And then to kind of tie that into what you were saying at the beginning of your discussion, the fact that Elaine and Nynaeve, despite all of their skills and all of their abilities, aren't that much better off, it seems, than the average person under the thumb of the Seanchan, I think really highlights just how kind of in the net it seems like these characters are, right? They are constantly dodging to avoid being caught when they're not even doing anything suspicious. And I think that's a great place to leave your characters when you're 100 pages from the end of the book or so. Um,
Well,
those,
and so much of it is internalized already,
yeah,
right? I'm a cliche literature PhD, which means I've read Foucault's Panopticon and taught it more times than I could possibly imagine. But the
yeah,
whole idea behind that book on discipline and punishment
yeah.
is that the way we exercise power is by the externalized threat, which becomes internalized, and that is very much what we're seeing across all of the Seanchan's powers,
Yeah.
particularly here. So for people that don't know that essay, it's essentially based around Jeremy Bentham's prison design, which is one guard tower in the center that can look from his position into any cell, and the prisoners can't tell when they're being looked at, but know if they're caught doing something when they are looked at, then and so this has become a huge metaphor for all of like modern surveillance state,
Yeah.
right? That, we're gonna sue the pants off of somebody who pirates a song or a movie,
Yeah.
and you just have to assume in your house you could be the one that gets caught downloading that movie this time or what
Yeah.
have you. This is how colleges dealt with piracy when I was an undergrad. um
we are
yeah.
literally at the intersection of piracy and Foucault, which is like debate me meeting grad school me. And it is really weird what is happening right now. I am following all
Yeah.
of this and loving it.
And so the fact that, they have never been caught, but just because they saw the extreme reaction to
Yeah.
somebody using a power, they have internalized these rules and they're staying hidden. And we will see that even more extreme,
Yeah.
with a magical supernatural twist.
Yeah.
That Egwene is actually experiencing the punishment, so knows what it is directly. It's not just the threat of having heard somebody
Yeah.
else get punished, it's actually having been punished herself. But it's just it feels absolutely oppressive. And
Yeah.
the more I think the more prominent kind of fascism is in our world again, it's like
Yeah.
this doesn't feel wrong. And
Yeah.
you said an occupied city, it feels like France or Poland during World War II, and certainly some of our modern surveillance state stuff. So
Yeah.
um
I
but
forget
yeah, go ahead.
I forget if it was in this chapter or the next one, but there's a moment where the girls are just kind of like offhandedly chatting. And I think it's an innkeeper warns them about not discussing things like that, where one of the Seanchan could hear them. And that I feel like is that like perfect example of like Foucault
Yeah.
disciplinary power, right? Someone who is actually against the law, telling you what the law is and reminding you to follow it is, I think, the perfect example of what you're describing. Totally.
Yes, but don't break the chapter line. What did our two listeners tell us? Yes, and there's another example actually of the opposite being true in the next chapter too, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about. So, I think the only other thing I have about the beast is, and this is going backtracking probably in a way that's not worthwhile, but it absolutely reminded me of in the Two Towers film when they
Mm.
see the Oliphant. Is that what that's called, or am I
I
thinking
think
of
so. Yeah.
Timothy? And just they see Timothy Oliphant just striding through, and they're in awe because we all are. Um, and so they see that, and it's like they're just in awe. And then by the time we get to the next movie, it's like, let's just put 20 of these bad boys like
Yeah.
cruising across the plains of Gondor. And so I feel like it's that kind of promise again. Like,
Yeah.
let's have this one strike such fear and awe, and guess what's going to happen when stuff
Yeah.
hits the fan.
The monsters are the kind of thing that I want in my TV shows, but not in my books. And we are going to discuss in the next chapter something that I want in my books and don't want in my TV shows. So we can get both sides of the coin. I think it is now time that we dive into the dark as hell section of this chapter and talk about Egwene. And training is the word I'm going to use because that's the word that Jordan uses throughout, but ick. Just
Yeah.
a lot of ick here. My only comp reading this is 12 Years a Slave, right? Like this, it's brutal. What was your thoughts upon a first read here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the brutality, but I think I want to be so careful with my words. It's actually, I'll just say it's awe, right? Like
Yeah.
it is such a completely clear system that it is totally effective and feels
Yeah.
utterly hopeless. And, we know how stories work, and we're like, somebody's got to get her and somebody will get her. But in the moment of this chapter, it's like, oh, they've thought of everything. They've sewed up every loophole. And is that the right matter? Tightened every loophole.
Sure.
And so it really feels like there is, it feels like Egwene is feeling no hope, and everything I could think of, well, maybe she'll do this, maybe she'll do that. It's like, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of hope on any of those things.
Yeah.
Coupling Egwene in this chapter with the fact that the leashed woman in the first half is the one who didn't want to escape.
Yeah.
You see it all working together and clicking together. So I think I already said the most kind of upsetting part to me in some ways was the jug, that it was just an independent thought, right? Kind of Minority Report, right? Like the thought of a future crime can get you arrested, and it felt like that just means this is pretty hopeless if,
Yeah.
she knows any part of the plan at any
The
time.
the thing that for whatever reason gets to me, like I am just by having read stories that are this dark and seen things like this, like pain is something that I expect in scenes like this. For whatever reason, the fact that the Adam can also make you feel sick when you try to channel, like I know how little I ever want to eat a blue popsicle because of the one time I was sick after eating a blue popsicle, and I cannot imagine that being weaponized against me.
Yeah.
That was just, ugh, I hate it. Um, a couple of interesting things jump out to me in that section where I think you're right. Kind of the main goal is just to make Egwene feel good and truly completely boxed in. But one moment that really stuck out to me is it seemed like all of the kind of things that were creating problems for Egwene were Adam related, right? It felt like if she could just get out of the Adam, lots of these kind of things that were boxing her in would go away, right? It's that stops her from moving, that stops her from channeling, that stops her from doing violence. But the one thing that stood out to me is there is one moment where the Adam is not required for her to get caught. She says that many of the women who are Suldam, they get what she refers to as an affinity and can tell when people are channeling even when they're not wearing the bracelet. And so that was the first moment where I was like, okay, it seems like Nynaeve has a way of maybe getting the necklace off. It seems like all of Egwene's problems are necklace related. And then suddenly, ooh, no, there's something else there that's getting in the way. So that was the one like anachronistic detail that stood out to me. But there's a good 2-3 pages here where my notes are just like, oh my God, oof. Oh, I feel so bad for her. And there's not much else to say there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would add one of the other details that stood out to me as being particularly upsetting is how she's essentially being passed around between different, and it's that Rena has the priority. But I think, it's not a sexual thing, but there's a weird like resonance there, a valence to it that's like, yeah, like you are being so utterly controlled by this woman, and if she wants, she can just pass you around, and like other people can control you, and yeah, she'll take you back when she wants you. And it almost feels like gross cults where the leader is everybody's husband, and he'll let other people take wives, but when it's his turn, and it's so like it's like she's been dehumanized so much. But that one stood out to me as like, you are just an object now, and you can get lent around, and it's pretty upsetting within that.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for me, all of this for Egwene feels like painful and hopeless. And then we learn that even those who Egwene thinks of as like way above her and probably more powerful and able to break through this, then we learn about Rima, now known as Pura, and the fact that there are Aes Sedai who have already seemingly been completely broken by this, I feel like just adds another layer. It's one thing to know this is crushing to you. It's another to know that it's crushing to the group that you've looked up to for a long time. And I think that is a moment where I kind of went, oh, this is even further than I had originally anticipated. If they're not just looking for new channelers, but people who have been channeling possibly for decades and still breaking them.
To go back to what I said to, my mind is constantly still trying to figure out I've called it the order of operations of these villains. And it's like, okay, if there's hope for stopping the Seanchan, you would have thought it was the Aes Sedai, but no, there is no hope. And, especially we've now seen the capture of Egwene in that moment. And then we get Rima's capture recounted to us in the next chapter. Now I'm breaking the line. And so in both of those, it's like, yeah, it's completely overwhelming. And so unless the numbers were just so far on the Aes Sedai side, yet at the same time, we know that Nynaeve already has exhibited some powers that the Aes Sedai are surprised by. And so that if I have a glimmer of hope in all this, it's the fact that Nynaeve and then also Rand are not what they are expecting. They are expecting Aes Sedai, and yet there are two who in different ways break those expectations. And so hope still glimmers in the midst of all this darkness. Now, in terms of seeing how hopeless Egwene is, the moment when she's like, look, Min, I'm going. You need to just run.
Yeah.
And, she'd done so much to save Min and kind of given in and healed to protect Min, to be like, it's hopeless for me. You should just go. That was pretty devastating. And
Yeah.
it's not the last moment in this chapter, but it's probably the most resonant one, as then Rena enters and it's like back to well, she gets renamed at
Yeah.
that moment.
Well, and I think the fact that it is seemingly the moment where Egwene gives up is the moment where she realizes her actual value to the Seanchan, right? I think to some degree, Egwene had kind of been banking on, like, they have dozens of Damane. There are, a bunch of people here that they can capture. I'm not even Aes Sedai. I'm not their, primary focus. And then the second that she proves that she can identify metals, it's like, okay, this is over. I am now too valuable for them to ever risk losing. And I think there's also, in addition to what you're saying, it's just a really heartbreaking moment from Egwene's perspective. But there's also something to the fact that they are taking the fact that we just learned a new, interesting power of Egwene's and making it into the moment that breaks her instead of a cool thing. I think that just tells you how far down the line we already are in this, right? We've only skipped a few weeks, but man, has a lot changed in her perspective in a few weeks, right? So I think if you're talking about new powers, Egwene has one too, but it's a oof, not a yay. And then the last part of the
Well,
chapter. Oh, God.
I was just gonna say, and then it's like, well, why is that so interesting to them? Like, so, okay,
Yeah.
she can tell the difference between the metals. From what we've seen, like, we have metal, or it's not like
Yeah.
metal's new, or we're ushering in some new technological age.
Yeah.
We have weaponry, so it's like, okay, so totally agree with what you said. It's devastating because Egwene is devastated. She knows this probably means she's going back across the sea.
Yeah.
But like, why? Could that really be that they came here and what they wanted more than anything was people to come find metal for them? And that seems weird and
Yeah.
bizarre. So of course, always agreeing with you, but then saying like, but then like moving forward, it's like, why? What
Yeah.
the heck is going on? So, you answer a couple questions and you get some new questions. So it's perfect. So yeah, talk to me about the end of the chapter.
I was going to say the end of the chapter, all I've got is Egwene gets a new name and it's going to be rough time for her soon. It's just a dark end of the chapter, and it's obviously, I think it's meant to be reminiscent of a lot of the prominent stories that we read about American slavery do focus on the kind of initial arrival and the erasure of personhood by the changing of name. And so I think this rings really true to that, but I don't know how much more I have to add beyond kind of the obvious parallel. Any last thoughts on the chapter? I'm glad to move on because but anything else?
No, except I guess the only thing I'll say is like, it's just the nature of reading a story where you're like, I'm not giving up hope because they're trying to make this so dark so that they can pull her out, I mean, and save the day or what have you. And while I assume the main goal here is to establish what the rules are that they need to figure out their way around and then push forward from that. But yet at the same time, I want to credit Robert Jordan with making you feel it.
Yeah.
Egwene is going to be different coming out of this experience, and to do that in so few chapters, I think is really well done. So he seems like when he wrote it, he had a plan. Why don't we move on to chapter 43?
Woof. Excellent transition. I have nothing to say other than like tip of my cap. And yeah, that's a gut punch of being both funny and why. Why did we have to? Chapter 43, a plan. We are now in Min's POV. She leaves, trying not to be overwhelmed by what's being done to Egwene. She leaves the building. She's crying, and suddenly she runs into Nynaeve and Elaine. They haven't seen each other in however long it's been since they separated, and so they kind of share information, although Min is very careful to hold back back on all of the details about what's going on with Egwene and only give some kind of surface level descriptions rather than anything detailed. She is worried that Nynaeve is going to immediately run off and try to destroy things. Min says that she knows a ship captain who might be able to help them escape, but said she's been afraid about what she's going to do because Egwene is probably going to be leaving soon, and the ship captain has been hesitant about going. And so basically, Nynaeve says, I'm going to go talk to the ship captain. We're going to get something done. There is a funny moment where Elaine says, man, I really wish Rand was here because he has a sword. And of course, we know that him and his sword are very close. But then they go and meet the ship captain, who, of course, is Bail Domon. No one is surprised by this. This is how Wheel of Time books work. And essentially, we get what I think of as the Ocean's 11 meeting, right? Everyone says, what are their skills and what do they bring to the table and what are their limitations? And it seems that Bail Domon thinks he can get them out of the harbor as long as he has someone who is able to stop the Damane from getting them initially in their exit. Nynaeve says there will be 3 people who can channel on the ship, and that should be enough. And he seems kind of heartened by this. He is a little bit concerned about who the 3 people who can channel are, first doubting that Elaine can channel, and then wondering whether or not it is the Aes Sedai who have been captured who will be aboard his ship. And once he has kind of the implication that maybe kind of sort of it could be an actual Aes Sedai, he seems pretty on board. They discuss their plans a little bit, and basically Domon says he will be ready, and Nynaeve says, I'm not sure we will be in her head. And that is where we end this chapter. This is a chapter that should never, ever, ever be in a movie because you can flash back to it. But in a book, there is nothing more fun than like 6 or 7 pages of characters building plans that you know are going to go sour. And you can look at them and wonder, is this where it's going to go wrong? So I enjoy this chapter, even though I find it kind of the last bit of fluff before we get to the real, meat of this book. What was your take as a first-time reader?
Yeah, so off mic before we began recording, I told Tyler, like, yeah, my wife asked, like, how long is this episode gonna be? I'm like, I never know. We always sit we can sometimes guess, but often don't know. And in this one, I was like, I think it's gonna be kind of short. The second chapter was kind of nothing. And she's like, aren't you at the end of the book? Like, it shouldn't be. And so I said, it's exactly that what you just said. It's the moment where they lay out the plans so that the final set piece of the book is, either follows that plan or where the plan goes wrong. And being the nerd I am, I think of Star Wars, right? The last act of Star Wars would be incomprehensible if they didn't show you an exact movie of what you were going to watch. Top Gun Maverick took this and said, why make it the third act? Let's make it the whole movie. And every part of that movie is, built around like, yes. And by the end of that, somewhere in hour 2, you're like, yes. And I know that this is happening. And then this is because I remember what you told me at the beginning of the movie. And
I hated that movie so much.
So all of this like felt exactly like this. And you need the characters to figure out what the plan is. We need to hear a couple things from Domon. I think most particularly, as alluded to last chapter, we had to hear that he saw Rima get captured, and in doing so, he's motivated to help. That is what I alluded to with the kind of breaking of discipline and punishment, of Foucauldian discipline, because yes, you then find somebody who says, no, like that cannot stand, and I have to rebel against this. And that's how, the system breaks down. And, in this case, obviously, we want that to happen. We want at least our friends to escape, if not some kind of larger damage to a part of this. So my main reaction is just, this is telling us, I've been guessing throughout this book how far we're going to get. To me, this was like, okay, so the last 50 pages is going to be this attempted extraction. And I assume this is where I'm speculating irresponsibly. At some point, the plan will go horribly wrong. All will seem lost. And then, oops, here's our other characters here to save the day and make sure it goes right. But I think, to me, that means we're pointing to a book where they will escape and everything will be right with our characters, maybe with a cost. But what will be kind of hanging over our heads into the third chapter is just how big these threats are, and that none of them are close to being solved.
As always, brief moment of silence to Judge Greg. Great. I think you're exactly right. I think this is the setup chapter that kind of lays out the stakes and lets us know here are the places where there are risks in the plan. Here are the things that are probably going to go off without a hitch because we only spent a half a second of them in the description. All in all, this is a chapter that I think kind of lays out the map, and then we can kind of play it along with that map as we go forward, which makes, I think, the beginning of this chapter really interesting to me because there's a good like page and a half of just Egwene and Nynaeve and I'm not Egwene, I'm sorry, Min and Nynaeve and Elaine just meeting and catching up. And it's really in contrast to the later part of this chapter because I think there's a lot of really specific detailed work being done in where and when are things happening. And the early part of this chapter is like, oh my God, you're in the city. I didn't know you were here. It's been 5 weeks. And there's something to me about these characters. I just assumed they had found themselves in the hours after the capture of Egwene rather than possibly weeks later. Did that strike you as odd also, or was it just like, oh, they're finally meeting?
I think it was surprising. I mean, it goes back to we have to see it, right?
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't have happened off screen. And so since we jumped forward in time, like we have to establish that. We've probably given short shrift to Min. And so
Yeah.
the main things about Min in these chapters, in the first chapter, it was that she's wearing garb that
Yep.
identifies her as Seanchan and as a servant, and she's been accepted as a servant with some rights and privileges, but a lot of rules still. And in the first chapter, she really tried to give Egwene hope, and that came to, I've seen you in the pattern. I've seen things that involve you that haven't happened, and if you are just dragged across the sea, they can't happen. But it was totally ineffective with Egwene. And Egwene's like, well, yeah, maybe I'm still involved with Rand, but they're just going to capture Rand and bring him across the sea, and that's where we'll see each other again. So, and then so where she's trying to be hopeful there, I guess it's not totally different as you alluded to in your summary. Here she's trying to lie to them to not let them know the level of darkness that's occurring. And it is notable that we can so obviously see those lies in this interaction.
Yeah.
And she's protecting Nynaeve, which is usually it's Nynaeve acting as protector, and would probably prefer she were being told the straight truth, but it seems like a mercy.
Yeah, and I think it is telling that Min has only known Nynaeve for a couple of months and knows her well enough to know that any upsetting information will cause her to explode. And so that's what I found really interesting about this is we do, you're right, we get to know Min as a character better. We get to kind of see her very optimistic attitude in a lot of cases, right? For someone who is constantly seeing doom and gloom literally over people's shoulders, I think she is, kind of showing us how positive she is, but she's also a realist. She is a very positive person who knows when not to give information to the wrong person. And yeah, I guess I'm not adding anything other than to say she's a really interesting character. Good catch. But Min's a great character. I think she's really well sketched out here.
And just the small detail that she wears pants and is like so mad and clumsy in her skirt. I mean, the tomboy trope is familiar, but that doesn't make it more endearing, right? That she's like not going to fit into anybody's rules for her, and yet has been forced into it and is sacrificing a little of herself like everybody else here is.
Yeah, and I think that this actually highlighted to me something really interesting about how Robert Jordan handles information, because I think there is a lot of things in this chapter that Min is telling Elaine and Nynaeve that they basically didn't know about either Seanchan culture or some specific situation, and Domon is doing the same thing, and Elaine and Nynaeve are doing the same kind of thing back. They're all sharing information that wasn't known by the others, and I think that this is a really good scene for me to highlight how well Robert Jordan does in tracking what characters know what when. And if you haven't seen a character find out something, I think the inclination as a reader is to assume that what we know is what the characters know, unless we're given a signpost that they haven't found it out yet. And Robert Jordan is much more inclined to just say, assume no one knows anything until I give you a signpost that they have learned that information. And so for me, they didn't know Min was in the city. They didn't know Egwene had been captured, despite the fact that they're observing the Damane almost constantly. There's a lot of information that I think I, as a reader, would have jumped to. They must know it. And the fact they didn't, I took as kind of a good reminder. Robert Jordan does not let his characters learn things offhandedly without you finding out about it. And so I think keeping a good eye on who knows what is a valuable lesson from here. Even as you say, I think that's all buried in really interesting character moments about Min that we didn't know going into it. Other than that, I think we get a little bit of kind of an extension of the state of Falme section here, right? There's a couple of discussions of when soldiers walk by and bowing and who knows to do what. And Min is actually seemingly very impressed that Nynaeve is even willing to do all of the bowing and scraping. I think just continuing to keep an eye on Seanchan culture and what it looks like was kind of my big takeaway from the middle section of this chapter. I don't have any big things to say other than like Falme is in a sorry state. It seems like everyone is on edge all of the time and it's bad. If this is our powder keg on a scale from 9 to 10, how likely do you see it as exploding?
It's 100% going to explode. I continue to wonder when, because again, there's very little book left, and I'm a reader who's always conscious of that. I think, my love of reading a tactile paper book means I always am aware. I always look at what the page number is and keep track in my head whatever I'm reading, and so what it then becomes a question to me is, does it explode at the end of this book, or does it explode between this book and the next one? And what comes to mind is Cairn, right?
Carrie Ann.
I said that right. Carrie, where it exploded off screen, essentially, right? And so it seems to me like I think however this plan goes wrong with all those predictions I already voiced, I think that will light the fuse. I'm just gonna butcher all these metaphors. It'll light the fuse, and then the powder keg will explode, and we will eventually catch up with the fallout. Now, my hope is that all of our characters we love get on this boat and that boat gets out. I think there are some good hints that throwing Nynaeve on the front of that boat or throwing Rand on the front of that boat is going to guarantee their safe passage. And so we hopefully will get everybody we care about. Seems like Robert George is the type, though, who might leave somebody behind, and that person's going to suffer through it all. So I don't know who or when or what, but I'm can't wait to find out, really, truly.
Yeah. And this leads us into then basically our last character who is in this city, who we haven't had an introduction to, who might be left behind if things go as poorly as you're describing, Bail Domon. Bail has been popping in and out of this book in little places here and there, and I think we see a very different Bail Domon in this chapter, right? Bail at the beginning of this book is like, I just need to get out. Who's after me? What can I do to survive? In the previous book, he was like, okay, Tom, I'm only going to let you stay on the ship if you can prevent a mutiny. But here, he seems really softened in a lot of ways, right? And it seems like what he's seen in Falme has done that. But in particular, as you've alluded to, seeing the capture of Rima seems to have had a really profound impact on how Bail Domon interacts with kind of the world around him. What was your thought on what I'm describing as the new Bail Domon, even though I guess we don't entirely know whether it's just his words or his deeds that have changed?
I mean, what else am I going to say? He's the Han Solo, right? Like, this is the moment where I'm not in it for your revolution and I'm not in it for you. But now he's like, actually, I've seen some things and it's true, all of it, right? And so it seems to me that I mean, I read everything here as this is his full intention. There's no duplicity here. We left him in a moment where he was about to like lie his butt off to try to stay safe. And so I think there could potentially be a betrayal there, but I like Bail Domon and I want to believe that he's saying what he actually genuinely feels. Like, he may fail at it, but this is what he genuinely feels and what he hopes to do. So and then the other thought coming out of that is like, well, they better bring Rima too. I mean, we better get as many of these women out of here as we can, both to regroup, but also just, the the description of the like please, please, and the pleading and all that,
Yeah.
like it's a pretty brutal little capture scene. So
Yeah.
I want to see it undone and these women free. But
And
could Rima be the one left behind? Probably not, but could be.
so I think what's really interesting to me in this sequence then is kind of the exchange of trust, right? Because Bail Domon is kind of taking a little bit of a step when he describes Rima's capture the way he does, right? It is very clearly framed in a way that is not pro Seanchan. And if these were people who were out to get him for being anti whatever, he's taking a risk. Then Nynaeve takes an even bigger risk, right? She shows him her Aes Sedai ring. She also inadvertently shows him Lan's ring, which could identify her personally as opposed to just being an Aes Sedai generically. She is putting a lot of trust in someone who she literally met 10-15 minutes ago. And so I thought that was a really interesting sequence in the sense of Bail Domon kind of giving a little and then Nynaeve kind of escalating their, relationship by kind of putting that trust in him. And then immediately it seems like Bail Domon's response is, oh, we have a chance. Let's do this. So I was curious what your thoughts on that kind of escalating kind of self-incrimination. It seems like they both kind of gave enough to the other to know if you betray me, I can betray you. But that kind of seemed to work in terms of them trusting each other fairly well. What were your thoughts on kind of that exchange?
Yeah, well, it's one of those moments where as a reader, you are just shaking your head and you're like, no, you're both fine. Like you're both good
Yeah.
people. And so, it's a little bit of that dramatic irony where it's like, no, I like you both, so you should like each other, right?
Yeah.
And so because that tension is there, so you're not sorry, the lack of tension, you're not
Yeah.
feeling the tension of who is actually good
Yeah.
and who's bad. It just makes you appreciate that they are so savvy with each other,
Yeah.
right? And we've seen especially the boys blunder into situation after situation to see kind of two people with a little more mastery, a little more worldliness kind of take that slow dance. It's kind of impressive in a way. Or it lets you just appreciate how they are making sure that they have mutually assured destruction, as you said.
Yeah, and I think this is the part of the sequence that earlier I was alluding to when I said this is a scene that needs to be in a book but should never be in a movie, right? Is in a book where you can give me 5 pages of here's the entire plan and some character work and some world building description. I think scenes like this work excellently, right? You can learn
Yeah.
about the characters. You can see, as you're saying, the kind of moral dilemmas that they're facing without having that tension yourself. You can kind of observe the plan and see whether it's going to fall apart or not and where you think that's going to happen. And in a movie, this feels like 4 minutes of dead airtime to me, right? It's just characters like, look, I have a ring. Ooh, I can tell you a story. It doesn't work the same way. And so this right here is honestly, it's one of my favorite types of chapters to read. I love hearing what is coming next, but on screen, I'm like, just show it to me. Is that your take too, or are you like, no, I like it in everything?
No, I think I agree with that. And again, that is also the function of the dramatic irony. It's
Yeah.
like, if you don't need to convince me in a movie, then you should just be moving forward. I mean, in our modern age where across all kind of genre fandoms, it's like picking every little nit
Yeah.
apart to try to say, no, that's why Marvel's better than DC, or that's why Star Wars sucks now, or whatever. I think you want to have some of that to just
Yeah.
make sure it's not so somebody on the internet can be like, actually, they shouldn't have trusted each other. Why would, if you
Yeah.
met a stranger, why would you blah blah blah? But I think again, I would this screams like ninth episode of a 10 episode season to me.
Yeah.
I think, well, I guess Game of Thrones, it was the eighth
Ninth
episode,
episode.
the
Yeah.
ninth was the climax, and then the 10th was the fallout. So I guess this would be the eighth episode where it's like, yep, let's just make sure you tune in live next week instead
Yeah.
of on delay and see what happens. So yeah, move right through it. Let's just get to what happens. And that's my
And
way of saying I love you. Let's shut this off so we can go read.
100%. We are now getting to the good part of this book. Next week, we will be reading chapter 44, Five Will Ride Forth, and chapter 45, Blade Master.
I mean, how do you not want to go read those two chapters with those titles? Those are amazing.
That is accurate. We are now at the point, we have 3 weeks left. So if you are at home and are thinking, man, I can't hold off on reading all of this, just read it all. You can listen to the podcast in the next couple of weeks. Greg, do not go.
I will stay faithful. I won't cheat on you. And we were talking off air about some of our plans. I think the thing to say is at this point, so we're not locked into anything, is that we both really liked that we got kind of the end of the book last year, right around Christmas time. And we're trying to engineer things so that we can do that. So that is essentially your warning to go buy the third book if you're going to continue on this journey with us. Rush out to your fine local independent bookseller of choice and grab the edition that matches all your other editions, because just people who switch types of books are just maddening.
Have a chaos bookshelf. Get six different editions of these books.
So that's your warning, and we will in the coming weeks announce specific plans, but let's just put it broadly at we will continue on into book 3, and we're also going to do some TV show coverage as we move towards the recently announced premiere of the second season this fall. So I think this summer you should spend with Wheel of Time paperback at the beach and with your Prime loaded up to watch some TV shows while the weather's bad, the rainy nights at the beach cottage. So yeah. Tyler, close us out.
I will just say this was the week, if you're listening in real time, where we finally got an announcement of season 2 of the Wheel of Time television show. And so I am just so thrilled to have more people get involved with this world. And if you know people who are watching the show, who are starting to get into the world and want a little more, please send them our way. We would love to have some more people join on and read along with us, even if they're starting at the beginning. And I will also say, as season 2 approaches, we are going to be doing several episodes where we watch and review the first season. So if you're someone who liked the show or didn't get into it in the first season and would love to jump on for the second, we can definitely be your on-ramp, as that is upcoming. So we look forward to talking about the TV show probably sometime in like July or August. And we look forward to wrapping up this book in just the next 3 weeks as we get forward through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.